There we go. Okay. So again, welcome everybody to the Mental Health and Wellness Center workshop that we are going to have tonight, focusing on grief and overcoming difficult challenges, difficult life transitions, and loss. We're going to get started soon. I see a couple of people are still coming. Hello, good to see you. We are going to get started, and if anyone has questions, feel free to interrupt me. So I think everyone at this point knows this is being offered by the Mental Health and Wellness Center. My name is Francesca. I'm a clinical mental health counseling intern with the center, and we offer services for everyone. So we do individual therapy with all ages, group therapy, couples, families, and we do workshops like this often, as well as staff development training. All of our contact info is at the bottom if you wanted to seek further support or learn more about the resources we offer. You can also follow us on these social media channels because we do post about our offerings like these, as well as mental health tips. So we're going to just go over group rules briefly. I ask that people turn their mics off to reduce background noise, but if we are having a time of sharing, or if you want to ask a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and share. We also ask that you would be respectful of other people's opinions in this space, especially with this topic. It can be very delicate and very personal. And of course, as always, please feel free to share as much as you would like or as little as you want. So this is our agenda for tonight. We've just gone over group rules. We're going to talk about types of loss, kind of define some of these, some of this verbiage, what is grief, different types of grief, and then talk about navigating grief and loss, and finally end on grief as a teacher. So I'm just going to go ahead, let me see, before I jump in, and mute everybody. Okay, so I want to start off by saying that most loss that we're talking about tonight falls into one of these categories, whether it be grief or a difficult transition as well. Loss of a role, of a person, of a place, or this kind of broader sense of a loss of where a person fits in the world. That's kind of how you can think about all of these things as belonging to one of these categories. And again, I want to say, I know that this can be a really difficult topic. So if someone is feeling overwhelmed or like they need additional support, you're welcome to take a break and step away from your device, or to message me if you're thinking maybe more support would be needed, but just an invitation really to take care of yourselves when talking about this tough stuff. So we decided to do a presentation on this topic because one of our guests at a previous workshop mentioned that it was something they were thinking about. And in hearing that, I wanted to be really clear that, when we're talking about grief or loss, we're not just talking about the death of a loved one or a significant other. There are so many types of loss. And we want to make sure to really acknowledge that all of these things on the list and more are loss, because once we recognize that these things are loss and that we can be in a position where we might be grieving these things, we can kind of normalize that and begin that journey. I don't think that it always is recognized, loss or grief when we're talking about maybe buying a house or relocating, right? The loss of possessions of a place, right? That can be a difficult transition as well. So on this list, we have accidents, buying a home or a new space, changing jobs or job loss, divorce, any separation, a breakup, getting married type of loss, having a child, leaving for college, relocating, retirement, selling a home, a serious illness becoming evident, and any sort of significant loss, a person, job, pet, friendship, anything that is important to you, or a new career change. These are all recognized as types of loss. And again, this is not a comprehensive list. There may be other things that you have grieved that are not necessarily listed here. So I just want everyone to kind of take a minute to check in upon seeing this list and kind of assess for yourself where you're at on a scale of 1 to 10 today. Knowing that maybe one of these things on the list is coming up for you, is maybe bringing up some different thoughts, feelings, or memories. So I think it's good to check in before we dig in to just see how you're feeling, and then we can assess towards the end as well. And you're welcome to share and put that in the chat or to unmute yourself and share. But wanted to kind of frame tonight as we're talking about so many things when we're broaching this topic. And I will do my best to check the chat as well as presenting. Sometimes I cannot see both, but it looks like there's nothing in the chat for now. Okay. And for those of you who are just joining us, I saw another person come in from the waiting room. We are talking about grief, loss, and difficult transitions tonight. And we are framing and opening tonight's time, really acknowledging that there are so many types of loss beyond death. Lots of different things that we grieve in our life. So I also wanted to define these two things, living losses or ambiguous losses. Those terms might be used to identify a bunch of things that we just saw in that previous list. So they're terms that can be used to describe loss apart from death, and can sometimes lack closure or a feeling of full endings. And they can be particularly difficult because of that. So you might ask yourself, how do we grieve those losses? There might be a pressure to move on if it's not sort of recognized as we in society recognize this person as that being something that needs to be grieved. Just want to mute everyone so that there's no additional background noise. So as I was saying, for these types of losses, living losses or ambiguous losses, there could be that pressure to move on, other people not acknowledging it. When we don't have those typical rituals, like a funeral, for example, or a wake, or even just a gathering to mark the end of something or the death of something, people can feel kind of a lack of ability to say goodbye in a way that feels healing and final and closed. And sometimes we might also kind of lack community support around grief in these categories of, things that are not so recognized. I'm pausing because I see Maria put in the chat, would we rate ourselves with lot of loss more toward 1 or 10? With a lot of loss, I see. So that's an interesting question. I wasn't thinking that I was asking you to rate your loss on a scale of 1 to 10, but rather seeing that list of things that can all be considered loss, realizing most of us have had at least one thing on that list kind of like come up for us in our lifetime. How is all of this sitting with you, knowing that we're going to be talking about it for the next hour? So it's really a bit more personal and a bit more focused on the present moment rather than how much loss have you had. But if that's something that's coming up for some of you, and you want to kind of think about tonight on that scale of how much loss, it's really up to you, right? Maybe 1 can be, I haven't experienced much loss or grief in my life, and 10 can be, I've experienced so much and I feel really kind of well versed in what we're talking about tonight. But thank you for asking that question, Maria. So I think when we come into a discussion about grief, most of us have probably heard about the 5 stages of grief, right? Here's an illustration of it. We've kind of may have been told, like, this is how we grieve. People begin with denial, they move on to anger, then bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So denial being, this isn't happening to me. This didn't happen. I'm not dying. That person didn't die. I didn't lose my job. They'll change their mind. Moving on to rage or anger, why me? That might be targeted at people who are alive, people who might survive, God, coworkers, really whomever. Bargaining is this sense of, yes, okay, this did happen, but, and there's this sort of can be a bargaining with a higher power, with people. So it's a stage where someone's trying to, or beginning to accept the inevitability of death, of the loss, of the transition, but kind of is figuring out or trying to bargain, how can I modify the situation? Depression is this acceptance of it and really mourning previous losses, previous regrets related to the situation, or mourning whatever the loss is itself. And then acceptance is, what we all would probably imagine it to be. Accepting the situation, the outcome, and feeling okay about it in the sense that we think we might be able to move on. This is generally how grief is presented to us. And what's important is that this is not the only way that grief or loss can present itself. So you might be familiar with those stages, and it might be the case that you have experienced these stages in a very linear way or in a nonlinear way, perhaps experiencing denial, then depression, jumping ahead, and then anger, and then acceptance, and then bargaining, right? So it doesn't have to go in this order. Many, many people find that they do experience these stages, but not in the order that they're kind of described. They might jump around, they might progress and then feel like they're regressing, even though we don't necessarily see that as a negative thing, but rather just the nature of grief. So kind of moving back and forth between these feelings. And research does suggest that most people do not go through those stages as progressive steps. Most people don't experience those stages in that order. So it would be very common for people to experience those stages in a different order. But what I also want to share tonight is that, you may not identify with those 5 stages of grief. That might not be an experience that you've had. There might be stages in there that you have not experienced while grieving a loss, or going through a difficult transition. For many people, grief feels more like a process where they're exploring what this loss means in the world, what it means for them or you as a person, your identity, and what it means about how to move forward in life. So this idea of what just happens eventually leads to, okay, well, who am I now in the context of this loss or this grief? And who am I going to be if I move forward, when I move forward? So this is a very different thing than us looking at those 5 stages of grief and saying, this is what it's going to look like. And I want to normalize this as well, because this is far more common than going through each of those stages in a linear order. Anybody have thoughts or questions so far? You can feel free to put them in the chat or to stop me. I'm actually wondering, before I go on, if someone is willing to share, and again, keeping in mind that it's really important to take care of ourselves throughout this workshop, and keeping in mind that, right, we're not just talking about death, or maybe the more difficult losses that might come up for us. This is, again, all the things on that list. Relocating, a breakup, having a child, right? Any life event that shifts your identity, even if we don't usually think about it as a loss. I see in the chat here, Noel saying, is shock a part of the stages? That's a great question. I think I'll go back here to the 5 stages. I think shock can be a part of any of the stages upon looking at this and thinking about it, my first thought is that denial has an element of shock to it, right? Like we are in shock. And so because this thing is so shocking, we don't believe it's true. It can't be true. So there's a real feeling of like, this didn't happen. I'm not accepting that this is a reality because we're in shock. But of course, that can show up in any of the stages. That's a good question, though. Thank you. So moving forward, if we're saying that not everybody goes through these stages and it can be much more ambiguous, then what can it look like? If we're saying it's just kind of this process where we're talking about what do things mean now in the context of this loss? And this is kind of a useful framework or idea of how the steps might go. And I'm hesitant to use the word steps because, again, I don't think this needs to go in any particular order, but this is some of what can be sort of expected for some people in a place of loss and grieving. So one might be accepting the loss. So starting to accept the reality of the facts surrounding either the death, the loss, the transition, and the meaning behind the loss. So accepting that, the person is not coming back, accepting that, the job that you were in is no longer your job and there will need to be a new job. Accepting that the relationship has ended. So that's going to be an important part of grief in any sort of stage, is this acceptance. So another thing that will likely happen is this experience of pain, right? Which is probably what we think of when we think of grief, right? So recognizing the pain and labeling the pain rather than avoiding it is very important. If we do not recognize it, do not own it, and we do not say, I know what this is, or I think I know what this is, and it is pain from this loss, or whatever the feeling might be from this loss, it can sort of grow, shift, change, manifest in other ways that might not be so great. And we're going to talk about that later in the presentation, about why it's important to think about this process and attend to it so that it cycles through whatever the process needs to be, rather than kind of continuing on beyond a normal, which we'll also talk about, period of time and turning into something else that can be serious. So we'll come back to that. Another thing that it can look like is adjusting to an environment without the person, right? So people who are mourning or grieving any sort of loss or transition have to learn to cope and adjust to the different voids that are left after the loss. So this language, is kind of pointing to a breakup or the death of a person or a pet. But there are always voids and these spaces left by the things that are now no longer there. And how do we cope with that? How do we adjust the rest of our lives to fit around this void? What do we fill the void with? And that's healthy and constructive. That's another big part of it. And then finally, or perhaps not finally, perhaps this comes sooner for some people, reinvesting emotional energy in different relationships or different parts of our lives, right? So part of that we just talked about, voids or spaces being left, right? We have focus and we have emotional energy that was likely going to whatever that thing was. And now we get to figure out where to put that instead, or how to use that. And it can be reinvesting it in things that are already existing in our lives, or discovering new things that we are wanting to invest our energy in. How's everybody doing? Let me see. I want to see. There are, oh, where did we go? There's some faces. Okay. So with that being said, kind of acknowledging that we know the 5 stages. That's not going to be the case for everybody. It's far more abstract than that. It's not linear. These are some qualities we can keep in mind that will probably be a part of a process. I want to talk about now different kinds of grief. We talked about different types of losses. That was a general list of everything from losing a loved one to becoming a parent to moving. And now I want to talk about different types of grief. Because while those are the different types of losses, we're now talking about the different types of grief as it relates to how we respond to grief, right? So these are different ways that our grief might show up. And I think this is really important because we probably talk about this less in society. We might not be as familiar. But as I'm going through this list, if there's anything that folks feel like, oh, I've seen that before or felt that before, please jump in, because I'm curious what, if any of these things, folks feel like they have heard about in general in life. So let's start with collective grief. So collective grief, we have a really unfortunate but useful example now of the pandemic. It refers to a loss that's experienced by a group of people together. So we use this term a lot when we're talking about natural disasters or any sort of mass disaster or casualty where a group of people are coming together and are united by this sense of grief and loss because of a particular circumstance. So the pandemic, like I said, is a good example of that. I think there was a lot of talk about collective grief as we have gone through this period of time. Another type is complicated grief. So this is when a person, or when grief is persistent, for a prolonged period of time. And it might be kind of hard to assess, well, what is a prolonged period of time? We'll talk about that in a minute. And we're experiencing in complicated grief an interference with day-to-day functions, right? So having a hard time getting out of bed, hard time just getting dressed in the morning, a difficult time completing your work, your job functions, caring for children or other people you might have to care for. Anything where we're feeling like this bereaved person is not able to complete different tasks. This can be a sign of complicated grief, not necessarily the case, but it could be a sign. And it also is usually accompanied by intense sorrow, intense pain, and the inability to think about anything else but that loss. A real longing intensely for whatever the thing is that has been lost, whether it's the person or whatever the thing might be. And it also might be characterized by numbness, by a feeling of just detachment, and then continuing isolation after whatever the loss is. That is how the mental health community defines complicated grief. And if that is the experience that someone's having, we would recommend that somebody seek support for that. And I'm looking in the chat, the Miami building collapse. That is a really devastating example of collective grief as well, right? As we're kind of waiting to see what happens there and waiting to hear about loved ones, if they're okay, grieving those who did not make it. It's a really sad but useful example. Thank you for that. So like I said, complicated grief, and we'll talk about it a little more later. This is a time where a person is really going to need additional support. And I said I would come back to this idea of a prolonged period of time. If the period of time where people cannot get out of bed, cannot do the things they need to do to survive on a daily basis, accompanied by all those other symptoms I just listed, if that's going on for more than 2 months, we might say that it's venturing into complicated grief. 2 months might seem like sort of a random number, That's how it's currently recognized. So if anyone has questions about that, feel free to reach out. The next type that I want to talk about is delayed grief. So delayed grief is when there's a significant gap between the initial loss and the bereaved person's reaction to the loss. So that might be because a person has lost a spouse, but they still have children to take care of and need to perform functions for themselves, for the children, to keep the household running. That might be a case in which there is a delayed grief reaction where months, weeks later, there's this onset of intense grief. That's can be a way that grief manifests as well. Next, we are going to look at disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief, and I'm glad that we have this list of all the ways that loss can look, because this is something that I think is particularly difficult, is when the death of a loved one or the loss, whatever it might be, is not acknowledged either by the larger world, their specific community, or even just close friends and family. So an example of this might be if someone experiences the loss of a partner, and the relationship was not something that other people knew about, they were not allowed to know about it, and someone has to mourn that loss secretly or privately just within themselves, that's an example of disenfranchised grief. And that can be really difficult because, as we'll discuss later, an important part of the process of healing is support from whoever that might be for you. And finally, I want to talk about normal grief. I don't love this word, but we do need something to kind of delineate between what does grief generally look like, what's acceptable, versus someone who might need more support, as in complicated grief. So in normal grief, we would expect that a person's impairment might be, a person's functioning might be impaired in some way. And again, it can be anything from the death of a family member, a relative, friend, coworker, even a celebrity, the loss of a job, income, the loss of a home or a car or a particular status in the community or in the workforce, a divorce, a breakup. All of those things are considered normal to grieve over. I'm wondering how this is sitting with people. And again, like I mentioned earlier, if any of this feels familiar, I would be curious to hear if any of it feels like this is new information. But I want to make sure that we have time to get through all of this. So I want to move on to navigating grief. So these are just bullet points that kind of say, hey, this is something that is important as you go through whatever the grief journey is or processing the loss is. And we're not putting any timeline onto this or saying this should be done first, this should be done second. We're saying during the process, these things are going to be helpful and important to come to a place of closure eventually. So one thing we have here is talking about the loss. This can help understand what happened, and remember the person if this is what you want or what they might have wanted. So talking about the loss is useful for multiple reasons, right? Kind of going back to what Noel put in the chat, there is often an element of shock. And so it's helpful for our brains and bodies to process aloud the events and what happened to kind of understand them better. Even if that kind of seems really simple on paper, it's useful for our brains and bodies to do that. And particularly with collective grief, or even just, maybe within a family or a friend group, it can actually be helpful for other people as well to talk about the loss if they also knew that person. Because avoidance can really lead to not only isolation, but it can lead to loneliness and really intensify those feelings of grief if there's no outlet, or there's no sense that these feelings that are coming up are being released. So I think I also want to say, I know that there are different styles, different approaches for different people, and some people might not want to talk about the loss. And that's okay too. We want to make sure that even if that's not a preference, that it's possible to talk about the loss. Because if someone is unable to talk about the loss at all, without shutting down or becoming hysterical or becoming very overwhelmed, that's something that's going to warrant further support. Another thing that's going to be useful in navigating this journey is accepting the feelings that are coming up about the loss. So we recognize that it might be a wide range of emotions. It could be sadness, it can be devastation, it can be just feeling really tired, it can be relief, it can be so many different things coming up. And it's important to not judge those feelings, because what is considered normal or acceptable, like, it's such a wide range because grief is such a complicated thing. So not judging ourselves for whatever is coming up, but saying, okay, this is how I feel, and at least identifying it is going to be really useful, and kind of giving it space. Because sometimes if we try to reject it and say, I'm not feeling that way, or kind of push it down when we are feeling a certain way, that can kind of bring on another host of issues or other feelings that can kind of become a shame spiral or this guilt spiral. I see in the chat, what if I've already talked about the loss a lot, but I don't want to bring it up again because it's a friendship breakup and part of me feels like I've already talked enough? That's a good point. So I hear you. There is a time where we might feel like, okay, we've talked about it. We've talked about it a lot. And we might not want to talk about it with the people that we've been sharing it with, because we might feel like, okay, they don't want to hear this anymore. Or we might feel like, I don't want to hear myself talk about this anymore. But I would say that it's a good thing to have talked about it a lot, and that it's not the only step, or I want to avoid use of the word step, not the only kind of thing to consider in this process of grief or loss. And that it's a good thing to be able to do that, which it sounds like you have been able to do. I'm curious as we go on and I share these other points, if those are also things that maybe you've already done. So talking about the loss, accepting the feelings, even if they're kind of outside of what we might think is normal for loss. Other things, attending to physical health in addition to our mental health. I can't overemphasize this. The way that we grieve, the way that our minds and bodies grieve, right? It's not just kind of a thinking process, right? Like, we are not just having these thoughts of, I miss this person, I miss this thing, I'm sad about it. Our whole body is involved in the grieving process. And so we need to take care of our bodies because it really takes a toll. So eating well, meaning eating enough, even if we might not want to eat, and eating things that we know are going to fuel our bodies. That's different things for different people. Exercising in some way, even if it doesn't feel like exercising, just moving our bodies, getting sufficient sleep, all of those things are actually going to really be quite important during the process, because our bodies really take a hit and remember the loss as well as our minds. This is out of the scope of this workshop, but if you're interested in that, you can look at something like a book called The Body Keeps Score. That's really helpful in explaining the mind-body connection, which we did a workshop on a few weeks ago, and why we really will want to pay attention to our physical body during a time of grief. I will also say, for many people, grief can manifest as physical symptoms. So stomach aches, headaches, nausea, insomnia, oversleeping, all of those things might be happening during the grief process. And that is also considered normal. So the next thing I want to mention is kind of going back to this talking about it piece. If the loss is shared with other people and you are not, having this disenfranchised grief experience, spending time with other people who are also experiencing the loss can be helpful for everyone. So you're helping others when you do that, including yourself. And finally, for losses that are going to involve death, remembering and celebrating the lives of your loved ones can be really useful. And it can be rituals that we all kind of are familiar with, but it can also be a really personal ritual or action that you come up with specific to that person. So a lot of folks find that rituals around anniversaries of death or anniversary of a particular loss can be a time of remembrance and honoring the person or honoring the loss, even if it's not kind of something that you do with other people, just noting it for yourself. It is not uncommon for people to have feelings come up or physical symptoms, like I mentioned, come up around the anniversary of a death or of a loss. And oftentimes we might not even put it together. We might not recognize that it's the anniversary of something and I'm having these other feelings come up, but that's also very common. So I want to note that, that we get to do whatever allows you to honor the relationship, the loss in a way that feels good to you. I think this is particularly important for those losses that we mentioned earlier that are in that category of ambiguous losses or living losses, where we feel like there's not necessarily closure. We get to kind of decide for ourselves, what is a way that I can create closure? I'm a really big fan of using creativity in mental health. And so, for me, something that has been useful is writing a letter to the person or about the situation, or creating a collage or a piece of art to kind of say, like, I'm marking this period of time or I'm marking this loss, and I'm going to create it and put my energy into this, and then I'm going to put it away, or maybe I'm going to put it on display, just to kind of mark something if it doesn't get that finality that we might see with, like we had mentioned, a wake, a funeral, like a closing on a house, right? Like those things might have this kind of mark in time of this happened on this day. But we get to make up those things for ourselves if they feel important. And if anyone wants to share, there we go, something that maybe they have done or do, you're welcome to do that. So, again, I really want to emphasize that it's actually really normal for loss to bring up feelings of fear and anxiety, because loss inherently is a time of some uncertainty. Even if sometimes we know in advance that something is going to happen, we're taking something away or something's being taken away, and we're left with a void, a space that we talked about earlier. and we might not know what to do with that. Um, it might take time to figure out what to put in that place, how to honor that space, where to reinvest the emotional energy, like we talked about earlier. And I generally, our culture really kind of emphasizes that uncertainty and not knowing is scary. And so I think fear and anxiety does come up for a lot of us when we don't know what something's going to look like after the fact. So we really want to normalize that. And Noel saying in the chat, multiple issues at the same time may take a longer recovery time. Yes, that is another great example. There's many more types of grief categories that I did not include here because I think it can be overwhelming. And sometimes as we go through, they become more and more nuanced. So I just wanted to kind of cover our bases, but it sounds like what you're talking about is compounded grief. And this idea of, multiple losses happening at the same time, layered on top of each other, can be particularly overwhelming and can take a longer time to sort out, because we're not just thinking about how do I cope with this loss? How do I reinvest energy and time that used to be over here into something over here if, oh, this thing is a loss too? It can take more time. And I certainly would want to say that if that is the case for anybody, to really give yourself that grace and that space, because there is not a timeline for what it's supposed to look like. I know that I mentioned the 2 months earlier, but I want to be really clear. That 2-month mark is talking about very severe, persistent symptoms. And you can, again, go back and review complicated grief. That is something different than people going through a grieving process where you're working through it on your own and able to kind of still function on a daily basis in the ways that you need to for a long period of time. That's something different. Thank you for bringing that up. So I wanted to give us time here to take a moment to think about what we can learn from loss. And even though we've said not everybody is going to go through those 5 stages of loss, this idea of what can I learn from the situation typically would come kind of toward the end or later in the process, where we can look at the loss with a little bit of distance and perspective to say, this has happened. I've accepted that this has happened. What can I learn from it? What has it taught me? Where am I at with my relationship to this loss? And I would invite each of you, if this is a present experience for you, to assess and reflect for yourself what this was for you. And I'm going to just highlight 3 things that might be a springboard. I really like the idea of grief as a teacher. So one thing we can assess is strengths. We might not think of this first, but grief can really teach us what our strengths are. It's a taxing journey to be on, and it can really highlight things that we are doing well, whether it be, wow, I really am good at taking time to do self-care. I'm really good at saying no, drawing a boundary when I feel like I can't do something because it's triggering, because it reminds me of whatever the loss might be, because I've had a hard day and I'm reached my limit. That might be an example of a strength that someone realizes that they have from going through this process. Another thing that we could learn is what we want, right? So grief, even if it's not some of these bigger tragedies, even if it's not a huge loss, we can really learn from the absence of this thing what we want, right? So, and it might also be what we don't want, right? So if it's a breakup, we might say, wow, I'm really recognizing it's super important for me to have a partner who respects my boundaries. Or I really don't want to be with a person who does this. Or it's really important for me to take time to acknowledge my other identities outside of being a mother or outside of being a father. Because this one identity of parent is how I spend most of my time. I really need to do something else to feel like I'm a friend, I'm a daughter, I'm other things. And I think that's really valuable. And finally, a new equilibrium. And I think this might even come a little bit further into the process, but when we have a loss in this space that we've talked about, we need a new equilibrium. Things need to balance out and stabilize again. And as we figure out what that looks like, we learn a lot about, well, these two things, right? Like what we want, what our strengths are, what else in our life has flexibility, what other things are going well, what other things we want to reassess. It really kind of, I don't want to use the word forces, but encourages us to look at like, okay, now that there is this space, this void, now that I have to balance it out and I'm finding this new equilibrium, like what else is here? And how do I balance the rest of these things? I'm wondering if thinking about it in this way, or even just these three kind of concepts, if anyone can identify a strength maybe, or even if you don't want to share what the thing is, even to say, oh, I did figure out something that I want or something that I don't want. And I think, even with relationships, as we're talking about like the what do I want, it's also really okay for it to be like, I'm missing that relationship. I do want that relationship. And to kind of say, well, these are the qualities that I really appreciated about this thing that I've lost. And I do want that still. Or it can be, I don't want that, right? Like there's so many directions that this can go in. I want to give us a little space. Oh, 1 minute, we have chat. Grief has shown me I have a resiliency I didn't know I had and taught me that no matter what, I'll be okay. That's really powerful. It might sound cliche, but I think that what you've shared there is really kind of one of those examples of like, we learn our strength and resiliency when we are tested, when we are pushed, and when we are feeling like we don't have an option other than to like, use our strength to overcome and move through the grief. Sometimes it happens when things are going well, but often it's when we're under pressure, right? Like I'm sure we've all heard that metaphor of, how does a diamond become a diamond? Like it's under intense pressure that it becomes, solid and shines. So I really appreciate you sharing that, Adriana. It can be quite incredible what we kind of learn on the other side, or even as we're going through the process. Great. And so I said that I would come back to this just in case anyone's feeling concerned. More kind of signs to seek additional support, because I think both things are equally important. On one hand, there is no timeline for grief. Everyone grieves in their own time, in their own way. And on the other hand, I'm just sharing these signs in case anyone feels concerned about what it's looking like for themselves or others. So these are some signs that it can be time to seek additional support. If we have a person where they're unable to speak about the loss without becoming incredibly distressed. If there's a relatively minor event that triggers a reaction that's very out of proportion with what the trigger was, someone who is constantly talking about loss and thinking about it. And then down here we have, this is applicable if it's the death of a person. So if somebody's not able to let go of possessions of maybe someone who's passed, someone might develop these physical symptoms similar to the person who was deceased. Those are signs that we're going to want to get more support for that person. And again, if these things are happening for more than 2 months, seek support. If there's severe impairment, if we're seeing major depression, thoughts of suicide or dying, people kind of like beginning to move just more slowly or speaking slowly, or the opposite, loss of contact with reality, this happens, right? Like this is complicated grief. So I want people to feel empowered with this information, because I know it can be a little bit tricky because it is such a complex process that looks differently for everybody. I'm seeing we have something in the chat here. In a special time of grief, I found a new strength and a way to unattach myself from the grief in order to accomplish everyday important tasks. That's great. And I think it's really important, right? This idea of, you, through your strength, through your resilience, you were able to do what you needed to do. Even though you're in a grief process, you were able to accomplish tasks that you needed to accomplish while going through this process, right? Like that's normal grief. And I'm really glad to hear that you were able to do both. So let's have a checkout. I know we started with checking in on a scale of 1 to 10 to see how we are feeling going into talking about some of this heavy stuff. And so I would invite you to check in with yourself again to see where you are, 1 being not great, 10 being the best ever. And you can share it in the chat or unmute yourself, but also you are just welcome to reflect on it for yourself. This is tough stuff, and it can even feel strange to kind of put words or a frame to an experience that can be so wild at times, and so different for each person. But I hope that having a sense of what might happen and what might be useful is something that is useful really for each of us here tonight. I'm going to stick around for a couple of minutes because we have a couple minutes left, but I'm going to stop recording.